We're in the little town of Warsaw, Illinois. And I think we might be on the Mississippi. We'll see. It says it has a historic district, so we're going to check it out here. An old Quonset hut with a marquee on it. Masonic Temple, 1898. A lot of empty storefronts. And we'll see what's straight ahead here, down the hill, maybe down to the river. Is that the Mississippi down there? Looks like it. Huge grain elevators here. It is steep. The mighty Mississippi. So unsettled, undeveloped. Neat. So you can put your boat in here. Hardly anybody here on a Sunday in August. Got a picnic shelter. You can play volleyball. A lot of space here. Wow, we just came across this. What is this? 1866. Is it an old school? Even a college? Wow. It's all sort of by its lonesome. I mean, there's just a few houses around here in Warsaw. See if we can find out something about this. And now we'll go back up the hill. There's schools. Warsaw High School. So let me show you where we are. We left Quincy, which I showed in the last video I did, and we drove north, headed for Nauvoo, Illinois, also on the Mississippi River. And on the way, we came across the little town of Warsaw, Illinois. And then from Warsaw, we drove through a hamlet called Hamilton, which is across the river from Keokuk, Iowa. And by the way, Warsaw is across the river from Alexandria, Missouri. This is all where the Des Moines River comes down from Iowa and goes into the Mississippi. And then after Hamilton, we drove up north along the river up to Nauvoo. And we discovered that it's a beautiful drive along the river on a road that goes right along the river, great views. And just for background reading, if you want to do reading about this and other parts of the Mississippi River, I came across these books. Two of them are by Dean Klinkenberg about things that happen along the Mississippi and road tripping that you can do along what's called the Great River Road, which is what we were on. And then I just wanted to throw in also that I've read the book by John Barry, Rising Tide, that was given to me by one of my old college roommates, and it's a great book. It talks a lot about the flooding of the Mississippi, mostly further south in Mississippi, but it talks about the fact that the Mississippi River floods from time to time and how that affects a central part of the U.S. So, as I mentioned, we started to see signs for the Great River Road, and it goes all the way from down in Louisiana all the way up to Minnesota. And going along the coastline of Illinois, the west coast of Illinois, it goes along for 580 miles, the longest of any state. So it's a real interesting drive to do parts of it or all of it. It's not far from major cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, Louisville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis. It's all right there, Des Moines. To go over to the Mississippi and drive along it, I think it'd be really interesting. I'd like to do more of it. And it kind of reminded me of when we were in Ireland several years ago, and they have a thing called the Wild Atlantic Way that goes along their west coast. And the total amount of miles of the Wild Atlantic Way is far more than 580 miles along the coast of Illinois. But it's the same thing. It's taking advantage of the waterfront, and you get to see a lot of different areas that way. So that's what it reminded me of. And so we went into Warsaw, which I just showed, and we drove down Main Street, and then we got down to the Mississippi River, and we drove along Water Street, where I saw that old building. And just a little bit about Warsaw. It has an interesting little downtown and a nice residential area, what we saw, and it has lost population since 1970, like so many towns in the middle part of America have. It's lost 14% since 1970, and this is what it looked like back in the day when people used to go on flatboats across the Mississippi. At this part of the Mississippi, it's narrower, but then it gets much wider as you go north. And so I looked up what was that old building that looked like an old school or something, and it was the Woolen Manufacturing Building. At least that's what it was originally. It was different things after that, but it was built in 1866. That's the year after the Civil War ended, and it's at 1401 South Water Street if you want to find it. It's great that it's still standing. It'd be nice to be fixed up. I don't know what it could be used for, but it's in a great location too, right on the Mississippi. So where I found out about it was on this website, Mississippi Valley Traveler. And then so after going through there, we went through Hamilton on our way to Nauvoo. And I wanted to mention one thing about Nauvoo is it is the last Mormon settlement before they felt unwelcome and migrated to Utah. So this was the last outpost before they moved west. So I knew about that. I wanted to see what was there now, and it interested me. And I also thought it was interesting that you see one of the historic sites shown on the map, the Illiniwek Village State Historic Site. That used to be the name of the mascot, Chief Illiniwek, at the University of Illinois. So to have a place named after Illiniwek, but it's in Missouri, right across the Des Moines River from Iowa, is interesting. So that might be an interesting interesting place to check out sometime. One thing I've circled here to the east of the river is Carthage, and I'll come back to Carthage and Warsaw and Nauvoo and how the three are related. So Nauvoo was led by the original founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith. It's where he led a lot of his converts and fairly large community, but it always seemed to be filled with drama. At times he had been incarcerated or tarred and feathered. Kind of violent things would happen to him, and he was young, good looking. He's only in his 30s, but he was charismatic, and he got all these people to follow him, and that started the church. And one of the reasons that everybody knows is why he was controversial is he started preaching that it was okay to be a bigamist, to have more than one wife, and that did not sit well with a lot of people, including people within the Mormon Church. So he was controversial from that standpoint and some other standpoints, but that's the one that stands out most. And coming back to Warsaw, Illinois, there was a journalist person who came from the east, came from New Jersey, and moved to Warsaw, and he no sooner got there than he started up a newspaper, and then he started writing things that were anti-Mormon and getting people all riled up against Joseph Smith and his followers. So this is where Carthage comes back into play. So Joseph Smith was told that he was under arrest, and what did he do? He turned himself in. He and his brother and maybe some other supporters, they rode their horses from Nauvoo to Carthage. He voluntarily turned himself in, and they were housed not in a jail cell proper, but in the jail keeper's part of the building, which didn't have bars on the windows. Anyways, a mob of people found out that he was there, and he and his brother were both shot and killed. And the picture on the left is of him falling from the window and people shooting down and across at him to make sure he was dead. So Carthage, from what I read about, it sounded like an interesting place that has some highlights, and the former jail building and other property on the block are now owned by the Mormon Church, and they actually have a visitor center there. So we didn't go there. We're trying to cover a lot of things along the river, making our way north, but this was several miles to the east of Nauvoo and Warsaw. So it might be an interesting place to stop and put that on your itinerary if you're in this neck of the woods. So like Warsaw, Carthage has also lost population since 1970, a little bit more, 26%. And I mentioned across the river from Hamilton is Keokuk, Iowa, which I was also tempted to go to, but I sort of recalled that I had watched a video about Keokuk by Nick Johnson, who has 1 million subscribers, of which I am one, and I felt like it wasn't a positive video, and it mostly isn't, but he's just showing what he actually saw. And the downtown has a lot of boarded up and vacant storefronts, and they've lost a lot of population since 1970. They've lost 32%. But in Keokuk, he also showed some really nice homes that are up on the bluff looking over the Mississippi River. So that might be of interest if you're in the area, Keokuk, Iowa. So I encourage you to watch Nick Johnson's video or see more about what's going on in Keokuk, a town that has had an illustrious past and was a much more important commercial center, but now has since lost 5 elementary schools. They're down from 7 to 2 elementary schools, and they have a middle school and a high school. So that's Keokuk, Iowa, right across the river from where we were driving north along the river. So let me show you the rest of our drive. We're in Hamilton, right on the Mississippi, just north of Warsaw, and we saw this historical marker. I think it has to do with all the people who have served in the military and been killed in action. We saw this monstrosity. Let's see what it is. And by the turbine there, we don't know what this body of water is. It looks like it's slowly flowing. It goes underneath the road bridge. Is this a river that flows into the Mississippi, or is it a slough? It's where you can put your boat in. And we're just looking to see if we see anything swimming in the algae water. There's got to be marine life in there, or reptilian life. Those are limestone cliffs across the way. Pretty cool to look at. The Great American River Road. Look at all those cattails out there. Kind of reminds me of the Wild Atlantic Way in Ireland that goes along the coast. It's Iowa across the way. Being from the Chicago area, I have never done this. And I bet you most people from the Chicago area haven't either. It's like occasionally you see some stuff sticking up out of the water in the middle of the river. That is. There's a shed or something out there. A little picnic area. Hardly anyone's here along this road. Great place to have a picnic. Occasionally we see these limestone bluffs coming up along the side of the river, like little limestone canyons. The river's making a big bend here. Saw a sign for a Joseph Smith historical site, and there's a river walk here in Nauvoo. Little historical village. So we're here at a very windy point of the Mississippi in Nauvoo, and we're going to describe to us what we're looking at here.
Have you ever been in Nauvoo before?
No.
Awesome. What brings you here?
Nauvoo.
Awesome.
So when we got to the village of Nauvoo and parked in the visitors area, my wife walked over to one of the historic houses they have there, and there were some young women docents who were more than willing to give a tour of the different buildings. So they just asked that we not film within the houses, but we could take pictures. So I just wanted to show you that they started off the tour in this historic house. And then they pointed out this house across the way. A lot of these houses used to be bigger, larger, so what is here now is just a portion of what used to be, but in the red brick house is where Joseph Smith's widow, she later remarried, and she lived in that house looking out towards the Mississippi River for the rest of her days. She didn't go to Utah with everybody else, and she's buried next to Joseph Smith on the property here in Nauvoo. We didn't go to see the gravesite, but it's there. And then our docents took us across the street. This is the house that Joseph Smith used to live in, and again, it was a larger building. I think it was longer and deeper, so they rebuilt this to show what the house looked like back in the 1840s, and this is before the Civil War. They took us inside, and we looked at some things inside where Joseph and his wife lived. Here we're walking into the house that Joseph and his main wife lived, Emma, but he had multiple wives. Sometimes his wives were married to other men at the same time. And on the main floor, they put up these reproduction pictures of Joseph and Emma Smith above the fireplace. And this is one of the bedrooms upstairs. Now, back in the day, this house wasn't air conditioned, but they've added air conditioning to the different buildings. And it's a good thing because this is right at the start of a heat wave in the Midwest where it was getting up in the high 90s, close to 100 degrees. So it was very hot, and it was very uncomfortable, I think, for our docents to be walking around in period long dresses on such a hot day. I'm not quite sure what the significance of this chest was, but I believe it had pointed out that it was where he kept a lot of his important writings, Joseph Smith. And our docents couldn't fail to be cheerful. This is just the same thing we experienced when we were in Salt Lake City last year, and we were met by various, usually young people, especially young women, that would be more than willing to explain things that had to do with the Mormon church, or in this case, the early Mormon settlement. So they're very welcoming. You can feel very comfortable. We're not Mormon. We're just interested in this period of history. And outside, couldn't help but notice all these picket fences. There's like picket fences within picket fences, so quite a nice look. So as we started to drive around the historic village, what we noticed was a lot of open space with no buildings. So we wondered whether there used to be a lot of buildings. Was it more densely settled and a lot of those fell into disrepair and were demolished because the Mormons all left? Or was it always sort of a spread out community? That was just a question we had. Maybe someone who's really knowledgeable about Nauvoo can write in the comments what they know of it, but we tried to pick up as much as we could from the limited time we were there. So we got to this house, which was called like a priest house or something, and it was by itself on one far end of the reservation, if you want to call it, and we got out here. And one thing I noticed was that there was this sign about the Trail of Hope. So I looked at it closely, and this was the route that people took as they started to leave Nauvoo 2 years after Joseph Smith was killed in that jail in Carthage. So they gathered their forces and they made a plan what they were going to do. And then 2 years later, in 1846, they all left looking for a better land to the west. And along the start of the Trail of Hope, they have quotes by different Mormons who were going to make the trek either by wagon, by horseback, or walking. We learned when we were in Salt Lake City that some of the settlers, particularly new immigrants from England, there were many converts to Mormonism that came from England, and they were the ones who tended to have to walk. They had no other financial means to go west other than to walk with pull carts behind them. So here's one early Mormon whose last name is Pratt, and it just might be coincidence that one of our docents that gave us the tour, her last name was Pratt. But he says, "Our camp resounded with songs of joy and praise to God. All were cheerful and happy in the anticipation of finding a resting place from persecution in some of the lonely, solitary valleys of the great interior basin, whithersoever we might be led." So they were going on faith that they were going to make it a long ways away from Illinois. And a lot of them walked all the way. Others took covered wagons. In 1846, looking to see what it says up at the top there. Does it say priesthood, I think. 70s Hall. And I think there are docents inside that'll tell you all about it. But it's a lot to soak up, and we've got other places we have to go today. It's beautiful though. But we weren't quite ready to leave Nauvoo just yet. We liked being there, so we wanted to go over to the river and see what the view was there, and it turned out they had a nice area you could sit along the river. Very nice. It's where the river starts to get really wide. And just as a point of information, how long is it between Nauvoo, Illinois and Salt Lake City? So I did a Google map search from Fort Madison, Iowa, which is right across the river, to Salt Lake City, and let's say it takes about 1,300 to 1,400 miles. Can you imagine walking that entire distance? I wonder if anybody does that to retrace the route of the Mormon pioneers back in the day. It'd be quite a trek. So who do we have here? We must have Joseph Smith. And let's see who else. Well, I think these are just two depictions of what Mormon people look like, which pretty much look like everybody else. And it wasn't Joseph Smith because he was killed in Carthage, and then they left here in 1846, and then they somehow got across the Mississippi. There weren't any bridges back then, and then they had to keep going west. So maybe their livestock and their horses swam across the Mississippi and the wagons floated. Don't know. Logistics. And many people walked. But somehow they got across the Mississippi and continued west to Utah. They got there a year later. It took them a while. So here's the mystery solved to how they got across the Mississippi. They built these flatboats to get them across, and they probably left those behind and continued west on horseback, in wagons, or walking. Quite a production. So there's no swimming or anything going across the Mississippi here. A little on the wide side, not to mention wild side. Here in Nauvoo. Just taking a little bit longer to look at that picture that was on that sign showing the flatboats that they built to ferry people across the river, and they had to go across several rivers en route. Another river I know they had to cross was the Missouri River, where they had to build these flatboats all over again and then go across the river. But it wasn't so well organized. They tried to stick it out after 1844, and the mobs that were bothering the Mormons just wouldn't let up. So they kind of left in haste in the winter of 1846, and the first sets of people, like 2,000 people, made the exodus across the river on these flatboats. And then as winter progressed, it got colder and the river actually froze up so that people could walk across the river. And I'm sure that was a little treacherous too. So just an amazing story the more you learn about it. So after we were at the riverfront, then we looped back on another road, and we did go across what is a reimagining, I think, of the downtown. I think that a lot of these buildings that we saw are rebuilt in the same style as the early 1800s. So it was very picturesque to drive up the street. As we were progressing up the street, it was funny. I'm going to show you a couple that were standing in front of the old post office building, like in front of that Dutch-style building. And as we were driving by, I was driving by slowly and had the window rolled down so I could take pictures. And the woman was dressed up in period dress. She called out to me and she said, "Hey, why don't you stop and come in for a tour?" And I had to say, I felt guilty saying to her, because she was being so nice to try to hail me down to come on a tour. It looked like they hadn't had too many people coming through on that Sunday. And I told her, we've already been through a tour and we've really got to get going, but thanks anyway. And we all laughed, but I just thought it was something. And if you ever have a chance to go to Nauvoo, please go on this tour of the downtown area. I'm sure they'd be just as thrilled to show that to you as the other things that we saw when we were in Nauvoo. So we continued on, and there were more period type buildings. It's very picturesque, and I'm not sure if there's a place where you can actually stay in old Nauvoo, but there are places to stay in the town that I saw, that nice bed and breakfast, but I know that they're not in the historic area. But Nauvoo is still an old town, so these bed and breakfasts are in like Victorian houses in town, which is further to the east, inwards from the river. And again, there were buildings that were all by themselves. Maybe they had neighbors back in the day, but this might actually have been one of the original buildings that has been fixed up, the tinsmith shop. And this was a building they call Colonial Hall. It just looks like a temple, like a Mormon temple type building, and you can tell from the different color of brick that it was once a 2-story building and then they added a 3rd story. But it's a very nice looking building. I'd love to go back to Nauvoo and just go on all the tours of the town. I just found it fascinating. There's the Mormon temple in town, high up on a hill. There's downtown Nauvoo.
I think this is a Catholic temple.
There's a Catholic church right next to it. Oh, is this the people we saw at the park? So there's some construction going on here. There's a river down there. And then here's the Mormon temple up on the hill. Nauvoo, Illinois temple. Really something. So we discovered that no visit to Nauvoo is complete without going by the Nauvoo temple, which is just a huge edifice that rises up above everything else in this small town of Nauvoo. And it's really something to look at. Clock up on the tower is telling the correct time. It was about 2 o'clock when we were there. And it's just really an interesting building, not just for its design, but for its height. And when I looked to the right, back down the hill a little bit, this looked like an older Mormon temple. I could be wrong. And this was a statue of Joseph Smith with his brother taking their ill-fated ride to turn themselves in, riding from Nauvoo to Carthage, where they were to be murdered. And the name of the statue is called The Prophet's Last Ride. Just a little piece of history, pretty interesting history. The temple was originally built during the 1840s, and it was finished after Joseph Smith was killed. And it was completed in 1846, which was the year that people started leaving to go west. So the temple was only being used for like 3 months. They knew they were going to be leaving, but they wanted to finish the temple anyway. So they finished it, and everybody abandoned Nauvoo. And then this picture was taken in 1847. Actually, it's a daguerreotype, which is a predecessor to photography. And then it sat there empty and mysteriously was burned by arson in 1848, heavily damaged the building. Then a tornado hit it in 1850. And then the Nauvoo City Council said the building had to be demolished. So it was gradually demolished, and then it was completely gone by 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. And there was nothing there for almost 3/4 of a century until the Mormon Church started buying back the property starting in 1937, but nothing was really happening. They were just clearing the site, gradually acquiring more land that surrounded where the temple was. And then they had a new temple built, a replica of the old one, and it was built between 2000 and 2002. Same footprint as the original, same exterior design, but it has a modern interior. So I thought that was amazing that the Mormon Church, they still want to state that they were here, and I don't know how much this temple is used, but it's there. It's very significant looking, so it's something to behold. So that's it for everything we saw on our day trip, going through Warsaw and then Hamilton and then up to Nauvoo, and we were on our way next to go to the Quad Cities. So I'll take you through the downtown as we drove out, and it's a typical looking Midwestern town with a lot of vacant storefronts, but old architecture that you hope never disappears. And then we'll go out through town and through the countryside. And then my next video will be on the Quad Cities, mostly on Davenport, Iowa. So thanks for watching. Soul on the street of downtown Nauvoo. The old Nauvoo movie theater. Thank you. That's pretty much it for downtown Nauvoo. Really interesting.